the point is they want a global version of that.
Yeah, I know.
And thus, what you've experienced and you seriously didn't like, quite understandably, they want to bring back and make that the norm globally. And they know that there's going to come a point where people are going to see that and there's going to be a reaction against it. So, and it's starting. So what they want, this is when you come to your point about why is it happening so quickly, they want to get that police military state and massive constant 24/7 surveillance, not least electronically, in place before that reaches a point where it becomes seriously dangerous to their designs. So that when people are starting to respond and wanting to do something, they have that surveillance in place. It's not, absolutely not, blatantly not, to protect us from terrorism. That is the excuse, not least because they're the terrorists ultimately. It is using the fear of terrorism to get the population to accept this police military state, surveillance state, to protect the agenda, the unfolding agenda from challenge. That's why it's there. The easiest way to get a police state and other extreme situations in is to create problems to which a police state is the solution. This is what, look at every time there's a terrorist attack in Europe. The answer is more control, more surveillance, more armed police and military on the streets, and so on. Now, in my new book, Phantom Self, and in the talks like on Saturday, I quote a guy called Dr. Richard Day. And he was a Rockefeller insider. He was an executive of Planned Parenthood, which is a Rockefeller organization that started out in the eugenics movement, which the Rockefellers were big time behind. And in 1969, he stood up, no one knows why, but he did, at a meeting of pediatricians in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because he was a doctor. And he asked them to not take notes and to turn off any recording equipment, because he was going to tell them how the world was going to change, because that which he was part of was going to change it. And he came out with a series of things. It must have been a long talk, because a lot of things that he said. There was a doctor in the audience called Lawrence Donegan who did take notes. And a few, before he died in 2004, he did a series of interviews which went out on an internet site, describing what Day had said in 1969. And he was describing the world now in very detailed ways, extraordinarily so.
Rockefeller was.
He was talking about the internet in 1969, which apparently was only invented through CERN in something like 1989. He was talking about smart TVs, which only came out in 2008, because Orwell was talking about smart TVs, the telescreens, in 1948, because this agenda's long, long term. And one of the things that he said was going to happen is that they were going to have mass immigration into countries, because he said it's easier to break down cultures and to change society in countries where there are many people that don't have any roots, his words, or history in those countries. And when I look at the situation of migration, whenever something happens very quickly and is then everywhere, the alarm bells should go off. I mean, just as a quick aside, take fracking. Fracking came out of nowhere, and suddenly it was everywhere. People protesting all over the world about fracking. Where did that come from? And if you look at what happened, and it's all a perception deception, there was this horrific picture of a little boy dead on a beach, who had died as a result of him and his family and others trying to get out of the Middle East into Greece.
That was the official version.
Yeah, that was the official version, yes. And suddenly, obviously, there was an outpouring from people that saw that picture of emotion, of compassion. Now, there's nothing easier to manipulate than genuineness that's not streetwise. And the idea is to feel the compassion, but then ask yourself, why am I being shown this now? Now let's look what happens after it. And it was immediately after that picture circulated, and there's this outrage of this outpouring rather of understandable compassion, that the real big pouring into Europe of people started. This is when Merkel opened the floodgates, not just to people fleeing wars created by the West. My response to that is yes, there is a reason why those people should be helped by those countries that created the wars. But that's not what happened. Yes, there were refugees from war, but the vast majority of people pouring into Europe on the back of that emotional outpouring triggered by that picture were young men. They weren't even families, which of course has created tremendous upheavals in places like Germany and Sweden and elsewhere. And if you remember, when this great enormous number of people started arriving at German railway stations, there were Germans on the platform clapping them in. You know why? Because the perception deception within those people, they were relating those people coming off the trains to that little boy on the beach. This is how perception deception works, and manipulating people's perceptions through emotions is the easiest gateway to perception.
They are not clapping anymore, are
They're
they?
not clapping anymore, and I said at the time, you know, they're clapping now, but they won't be clapping soon, because two things. First of all, they're different cultures. Now, you're supposed to be racist if you say that. Excuse me, that's not racist, that's absolute blatant fact. They're different cultures. And what they want to do, and this is the plan, is they want to break Europe up into subservient regions to the European Union bureaucracy under a world government, and bring an end to nation states. Because nation states have a sense of culture, they have a sense of history, and a relation to a nation state is a great resistance to having the nation state disappear. So stage one of this absolutely blatant opening the door to Europe is to dilute a sense of culture. The other thing is they want the clashes. They want the clashes because that gives you divide and rule, and that gives you not only a reason for the police state, but you, as you rightly point out, people in fear of what's happening, like civil war, demanding the police state. That's what it's about. And I would say to people all over Europe, don't see things in black and white, otherwise you're going to be played like a stringed instrument. If you look at the indigenous populations of Europe, and you look at the migrants coming in, if you could see symbolically what was happening, you'd see strings attached to the migrants, you'd see strings attached to the indigenous population, and those strings would be held by the same hand. They're playing people off against each other. And it's interesting, you know, so often over the years, the BBC, which is a kind of state-owned, controlled organization, whatever they claim, has put out so-called factional documentaries, like documentaries that are kind of supposed to be part fiction, part factual, have turned out monumentally accurate. And for instance, there was a documentary which was based on the fact that bombs had gone off in London tubes, and they had the politicians and the people reacting. That was what the documentary was about. In 2005, the London bombings known as 7/7 were an absolute mirror of what was in that documentary. And I remember, it must have been a few decades ago now, the BBC ran this documentary, which was based on vast numbers of people pouring into Europe out of the Middle East and North Africa and transforming European society and creating the clashes and the the conflict that followed. When you have people like the notorious George Soros, who not only is saying that he wants, vast numbers of people coming into Europe ongoing, or his mansions must be full then. Whenever Soros, who is a bagman for the Rothschilds, that's how he went out of Hungary and became a billionaire.